Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is enjoying these sessions as much as I do. I am leading a session today on risk and supply chain management. So my name is Robert Yaus. I'm a CISO and executive advisor at EVOTEK. I've had about 25 years of experience being a practitioner. So meaning that I've been in the CISO seat multiple times. And I'm being joined by Kate. Kate, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am Kate Cook. I'm one of the BISOs here at EVOTEK. I've got well over a decade of experience being both an internal and external auditor, as well as doing IT governance and standing up various programs. Very, very excited to be doing the Security Summit today and joining Robert here to talk to you guys about vendor and supply chain risk management. So go ahead, Robert.
All right. So before we get started, and I'm going to just lay out the agenda real quick. We're going to talk about the taxonomy. You know, what's the difference between vendor, third-party, supply chain? What are these categories have in common, the challenges, and then really just walk through a practical approach on approaching vendor risk and supply chain management, really from a practitioner perspective. So on the taxonomy side, you know, there's, I hear this a lot, and it's sometimes being intermixed between vendor management, third party, and supply chain. So I just wanted to kind of just go over the taxonomy, and you can see the acronyms here that I've listed out, and we're going to refer to these acronyms. But so this is the only slide when we distinctly talk about the differences. We'll bring it back together in terms of what all of these have in common. So vendors are a type of third party, but providing services directly to your organization. Third parties are entities that provide a product or services directly or through a vendor. And then we have the supply chain, which is third party, which is your external, and also supply chain is made up of your internal entities. So it's a mix between internal and third party. So those are the taxonomies, and you can see here vendor risk management. So that is risk management, VRM. Then we have third-party risk management. There's also third-party cyber risk management, supply chain risk management, and then lastly, cybersecurity supply chain risk management. So when there's cyber involved, the scope of the risk is really just focused on cyber. So that's really the taxonomy that we'll be using throughout this presentation. And I want to just quickly talk about supply chain attacks. Those are, we hear more and more, and they're becoming more common just because they're more profitable. So a supply chain attack works by targeting a third party with access to your organization system. So the common attack types, we have three here that we can summarize, is a compromise of commercial software. I think the best examples are SolarWinds, RSA security with the secure ID tokens. That one is a decade old now. Compromise of open source software. So we have as best example the Equifax data breach, exploiting vulnerabilities in the Apache Struts open source software framework. And then the last type of attack is embedding malware during the physical production of technology. So the best example of that would be Stuxnet in the SCADA systems that impact industrial control systems. Okay, so commonalities between supply chain risk management, third-party risk management, vendor risk management. This all, as you know, has to do with risk management itself. So it's identify and assess the risk, mitigate vulnerabilities, developing contingency plans for and alternate strategies. And the last piece is monitor and respond. So it is typically a program approach involving these four set of core activities. Kate, do you want to talk briefly why we should be so concerned on managing the risks associated with vendors, third parties on the supply chain?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's so many different things. And I think that people, when they think about their TPRM programs or SCRM programs, they relate it back to their audits, right? So you have to have it as part of part of your audit programs. And it's much bigger than that. It's really about understanding who your vendors are, what are they doing for your organization. That business impact analysis, it runs in with your incident response. If your vendor goes down, how is that going to impact your organization? If those services are no longer available to you, can your organization still function? Understanding those data flows, that's hand in hand with GDPR. Who has your data? Where is your data at? Where is it flowing to? What security controls are around them? And then who also has access to it? Which also leads into your regulatory requirements. If we look at it from a healthcare perspective, for example, you have to understand who your entities are and ensure that they have appropriate contractual obligations in place and that the appropriate flow down is in place too. They have to meet certain regulatory requirements, but so do those vendors that are also assisting and helping with the services that they are providing to you. So a lot of these things are really, really key in order to not only to make sure that your organization is compliant, but that it can still continue to function should something happen with your vendor. Robert?
Thank you, Kate. That was a great overview. On the regulatory and client obligations, I do want to point out some upcoming rule changes the SEC is advancing for a decision-making in the early Q2 of this year. So it's a spring 2023. Part of the rule change, or the majority of the rule changes are really focused on risk assessments and the oversight of information security and risk management. There's specific language in the proposed SEC rule changes that require the assessment of third-party risk as part of the overall risk assessment program of the organization. And I copied the language from the current proposal rules here on this window, and you can see, the requirement is not having policies, but also having procedures in place to oversee and identify the cybersecurity risks associated with the use of any third party, including but not limited to those providers that have access to the registrant's customers and employee data. So it is pretty broadly defined. I want to point out it is a third-party risk assessment which is required, not only a vendor risk assessment. So whether, to what degree these rules are going to take effect, that is still pending, but we fully expect these rules to be adopted in the spring of this year. I want to also talk a little bit about, the cost of third-party data breaches. I've given some examples on third-party or supply chain breaches. They tend to be fairly costly, as you can see here. I'm illustrating here a graph from the IBM's cost of data breach report of 2022. You can see the breach per record here is north of $4.50. It's $4.55, and you can see from a frequency perspective, it is around, what is that? I would say 12.5%. It's estimated that, your chances of being involved in a data breach is going to be, around, north of 50%. So it's absolutely, I think, critical to identify the risks in your third parties in your supply chain and actively manage those risks within the organization. Some of the challenges, so really the big question is, why do these data breaches, why do these incidents continue to happen despite the focus on supply chain risk management, third-party risk management? These concepts are not new. They've existed for decades. Millions have been spent trying to get ahead of it, but we continue to have problems. And so I tried to summarize some of the challenges that we have here. So in supply chain risk management or third-party risk management, the composition of your supply chain is very complex in today's world. So often you have hundreds or thousands of suppliers that contribute to a single product. So, again, it's not only the linkage, but, the level of outsourcing partners drive a lot of complexities in there. Second part is risk assessments themselves. Most risk assessments are going to be qualitative in nature. And even though I think impacts are going to be somewhat easier to determine for the organization using different types of risk dimensions and risk scales, the likelihood of events is extremely difficult for third parties and supply chains. And one of the reasons is the lack of visibility into these third parties. There's some proprietary restrictions that prevent, disclosures, transparency. So having a qualitative risk assessments where the likelihood cannot be determined with a level of accuracy makes these risk assessments they're going to be somewhat inaccurate in nature. And so when you look at the output of third-party risk assessments, supply chain risk assessments, the scales of risk, they vary quite a bit. And therefore, it's very, very difficult to really come up with a strategy how to effectively mitigate all of the identified risks. It's a very complex project. So two-prong approach here will be my suggestion. We will have known risks from the risk assessments, and those risks would need to be mitigated if they exceed the organization's risk tolerance. But there's going to be the unknowns. There's going to be just unknown circumstances, and so one needs to prepare for the worst and develop strategies to increase the resilience and response to unknown risks in order to provide continuity to the business in kind of that worst case of something really catastrophic happening within your supply chain or with a third party. So that said, I'm going to go over a practical approach. I'm going to cover from kind of beginning to end. We're going to create some talking points about, where do I begin? What's important? What do I need to focus on? And maybe some just practical examples and items to focus on to begin standing up a program and driving the maturity over time. Supply chain risk management, third-party risk management is a foundational activity. It is tied to risk risk management. And those who are in security know that a security program is almost always risk aligned. So supply chain risk management, third-party risk management, being part of risk management makes this activity, makes this function foundational to an information security program. And therefore, and because it has such wide implications and facets within the business, again, it's a programmatic approach that would be required to set up an activity that can be sustained and matured over time. So it really starts with setting a foundation, getting the leadership buy-in. Again, I think practical ways is looking at your regulatory requirements, looking at your legal requirements. If you're not doing it today, you are likely required to do it today. Maybe you just haven't really defined all of the requirements to drive that program. You should define your supply chain risk management framework. You should be specific, whether it is supply chain, whether it is third party, whether it is vendor. You can have sub-programs. Also define your target maturity and, based off your current organizational capabilities and where you want the organizational capability to be. This is a program, and then within the program, you can execute with various different maturity capabilities. At the beginning, you will be more at the initial phase. Perhaps you have more on the governance side, but really try to think of it as, what is our target maturity based on the inherent risk of our organization, the risks that we face, the compliance drivers, where should we be in terms of target maturity? So having target maturity aligned with the inherent risk of the company, coupled with your legal and regulatory requirements, will set you up in order to determine where you need to be. Ultimately, though, don't overcomplicate things. The key is to make faster and better informed decisions by simplifying, your existing third-party risk management process. Look what's broken. Take a look on what's mostly time-consuming. Simplify it so you can quickly go through, identify, assess, and track. So who do you need to assess? That's a good question. There's various different levels of engagement with third parties, or when you look in your overall supply chain. So, a good starting point is really looking at what are all your current risk elements. Take advantage of a business impact assessment. Business impact assessment will tell you how critical your business processes are and where you need to focus on. Classify those vendors based on risk and impact. You should develop, again, a classification scheme. You can use simple tiering. Tier 1 vendors would be all of your prime vendors that are critical to the business mission, that have critical or highly sensitive data. It's the combination of both which creates most of the risk. Create sub-tiers underneath tier 1 and look at your tier 2 and 3 vendors. Those are equally important. Statistically speaking, most of the supply chain attacks happen at tier 2 and tier 3 vendors. Tier 1 vendors usually are larger organizations. They have enough resources to manage a mature information security program, not necessarily your tier 2 and tier 3 vendors. So those need to be in your scope as well. And develop, just for your internal reporting, develop a vendor risk scorecard. You really just want to know, at a glance, what are your critical vendors? What are your tier 2, tier 3 vendors? What does the risk profile look like? What does the impact look like? And that could just be a very, very good starting point to start managing risk. I'm going to turn this over to Kate on assessment types.
All right, and hopefully you guys can hear me better now. So to piggyback off of who to assess, great. We're looking at the assessment types, right? So if you have a vendor that is going to be accessing, transmitting, managing your data, storing it, you're going to do a much more in-depth type of assessment with them. And it's just because of the level of risk that they have. Now, if you have a company that is not going to that extreme, you're going to have more of a lighter assessment. And so that's why it's so important that when you first are brought these vendors by the business owners for an assessment process, that you have a very, very, very clear understanding of the scope of the services that they are going to be providing. Not only the scope of the services, but what exactly are they going to be doing for your organization? What is that business impact analysis? So what impact are they going to have to your company? And then what type of data are they going to have? What type of access? Having that clear understanding is going to help you to understand the level of assessment that's going to need to be performed. Another key critical thing as far as your assessments go is they're tedious, right? So some of you have thousands of vendors, hundreds of them. And so to have a team of 1 or 2 people that are doing these vendor assessments on a constant basis, you have to understand and use and leverage what you can. So those certifications and those audits that the vendors have can definitely be used and leveraged. That does not mean that they can be used and leveraged for the entire assessment process. When you look at those certifications and audits, it's good to understand how is that applicable to the services that they're offering to you, and then what additional questions do you need to ask and gather evidence for in order to do further validation of the security controls that are in place. If you listened to the session earlier, pen testing was brought up. If there is an application that you are using and leveraging from a vendor, always get a pen test. Get one on an annual basis just to continue to do that validation. Is the code secure for the application that you're going to be using and leveraging? A lot of this right now for a lot of companies is very manual. There are tools out there that you can use to automate a portion of it. Some of it is still going to be very manual. So when we talk about the automation part, those questionnaires that you put in, the intake process, creating a vendor profile for them and sending those questionnaires out, even on a scheduled basis, that all can be automated. The manual piece that's still going to continue to have to be done is you're going to have to continue to look at that evidence and those artifacts to validate, okay, did they answer the question? Does this evidence that was provided actually meet the requirement before you are able to provide some sort of sign off to say, okay, we feel comfortable moving forward with this vendor. Robert?
Thank you, Kate. I've been on both ends. I've done perform risk assessments myself and also responded to risk assessments. So, there's a fine line between level of depth and, using automation versus manual. It's tricky when you have limited resources, which I assume is applicable for most of us. All right, so on the risk side, I think one of the key important elements or takeaways should be to leverage your enterprise risk management framework. As I said before, vendor risk management, third-party risk management, supply chain risk management are all part of the risk management function, and therefore they should fit in within the organizational defined frameworks for risk management. Couple of things here to point out. An enterprise risk management framework will have very good definition of the organization's inherent risk, the risk assessment methodology, the risk dimensions and the risk scales. For example, when measuring the impact of a third party or of the supply chain to the organization, what are already the defined risk dimensions? Risk dimensions could be financial, operational compliance risks, reputational risks. There's multiple dimensions to measure impact. And what are those risk scales? Is it, on the financial side, when you have qualitative assessments, you want to know what low impact is. Is it under $100,000? Is it under $500,000? What is low medium? What is medium? What's high? What's critical? And it's very important to, again, adhere to your risk management framework. So when you talk about risk, when you talk about, there's a medium high risk in terms of these qualitative outputs, that they are, those risk scales are already, number one, they're defined within the organization, and therefore, when communicating these risks, when discussing it with your risk management committee, they will know the scales because you're working off a defined framework. Other advantages of using an enterprise risk management framework is risk treatments are typically defined on an organizational level, which level of risks can be accepted, based on the defined risk tolerances, which risks require treatments, and how do those treatments get enacted? How are those being communicated? How is risk being reported? How do risk mitigation action plans get tracked? And how do those flow into enterprise resource planning? All of that would be very cumbersome to define. And the best approach, again, is using and leveraging your enterprise risk management framework. Now, if you don't have an enterprise risk management framework, that would certainly be a starting point to look at how the organization should be measuring risk, how they should be communicating, reporting risk, treating risk, and what leadership oversight and even board of director oversight is required or should be in place to manage your risk. Moving on to contracts, and again, I'm going to hand this one to Kate.
All right, so your contract process. By this point, you should have an idea of who your vendors are, who your business associates are, depending on your industry, as well as what that risk is. Were there any issues with your with your risk assessment that were performed that you require remediation requirements? All of these things are going to go into your contract. So you should understand whether or not you need a data privacy or a data processing addendum, a data security addendum, those remediation requirements. Let's say, for example, someone's storing their data and they don't encrypt at rest. And you say, okay, we're still going to continue with you, but you have to agree within 30 days that you're going to set up encryption at rest. Definitely always put that within your contract so that there's some level of accountability there, and you can always defer back to it. Your notifications, so breach notifications are big. So always look at your breach notification requirements, your state requirements, your regulatory requirements, and make sure that you're in line with that, and that's in your contracting. Reporting is also a big one. So as far as SLAs and any other type of reporting metrics that you may need for your business and your organization, ensure that those are put in as well. But the main thing is ensuring that those contracts and those addendums are scoped specifically for the services that are being offered. You don't want to hold an organization accountable for something that's not within scope of their services, but at the opposite end, you don't want that organization that may manage your data stating that you hold the responsibility and accountability for the security requirements surrounding those, which I have seen that happen. So be very careful that you always review your contracts. Communication. So Robert, I'll hand that over to you.
Okay, so we're kind of halfway through. We spent a lot of time discussing, what to assess, how to assess at the risks and contracts. So once a contract is signed, it is critical to think about all of the coordination elements, right? You don't want to necessarily, just, give a vendor access to your system, transferring data. There should be, again, these activities need to be controlled. So who has access, which are the identities, exactly what has, the protocols that are followed, and have that well documented is going to give you pretty good control, ensuring that access to data and data transfers are performed as required or as designed. Other items to note is for business continuity, when you bring on a vendor, if the vendor is fulfilling a critical function, update your business continuity plans, update your disaster recovery plans, also include updates in your incident response. Even when testing for highly critical vendors that are core to your business, include them in business continuity testing, include them in your DR testing. And when you do a tabletop exercise or incident response exercise, include them in the planning and execution of these exercises. From a monitoring capability, we see monitoring as an important component. The key advantage of monitoring and the purpose of monitoring is to catch vulnerabilities before they become threats. And you want to be able to react more quickly when problems occur. So there's different levels of monitoring. Typically, so number one is you can automate some of these the monitoring activities. There's vendors that will it's the core business of what they do is looking at from the outside in, seeing everything that they really monitoring things like your the vendor's network perimeter, ensuring controls are in place, etc. So that's kind of that outside in view, but you can also insist on trying to get more of an inside view into your organization around service levels, service metrics, uptimes, things of that, to get as much data as possible, again with the intent that you want to catch vulnerabilities before they become threats and react more quickly. So that's the intent of the monitoring. And these monitoring activities, what exactly to monitor, it's usually best if you can apply that to your individual business and individual risks that you have within the organization. So if you're if you're concerned about a supplier's availability due to the location, because they are say in an area where there's where they go through a hurricane season every year, and that's going to impact your supply chain. One of your monitoring items could be the weather patterns over that region, just as an example of a monitoring capability that is custom to your organization. Moving over to you, Kate, on reassessment.
Okay, so at this point, you guys should have a good idea of all the vendors that you have in place and the tier level, everything's integrated. So it's time for your annual reassessment. At this point, you need to look at it and determine for your tier 1 vendors, you should at a minimum have the right to audit. You have to determine, and typically I would suggest like maybe 25% of your tier 1 vendors on an annual rotation do an actual audit. And then you've got the assessment process as well. So the questionnaire that you hand out to them, the evidence collection, the certifications, things like that, in order to help minimize the impact to your teams. You're not just going to be looking at your tier 1 vendors. So you should be doing an assessment of all of your vendors. Definitely look at the impact to the organization and the risks that they hold. So those items, for example, that require remediation, did you check back in with them to validate whether or not those items were actually remediated, and did you validate that? One thing that often goes overlooked, though, as far as an assessment process is scope change. So if you have a vendor that, when you first set up services with them, did not require access to data, and then later on they changed the contract agreement to say, okay, we're going to expand the services that we do with this vendor, and now they're going to have access to our data. Well, that's a completely different type of assessment that you would perform on them. So you need to make sure that you're working very closely with the business owners as well as your legal and privacy team to make sure that those are always communicated with you so that you can go back and reassess as appropriate. All right, vendor or Robert, I think termination of contract is the last one we've got.
Yeah, this one, in my experience as a practitioner, really overlooked. So at the end of an engagement, how the termination is being communicated, coordinated, any data transfers, data exports, most importantly, data destruction, and having documentation on successful data destruction. You really don't want to have a vendor, third party, having your data post a contract. So closing out a contract is extremely important. And then lastly, your legal team will mostly cover this, is think about the survival terms, right? Confidentiality of information, and any other types of terms and conditions that are applicable based on the contract. And that really concludes kind of our practical approach to the life cycle. I do want to offer up, there are some really good free resources out there. CISO has provided excellent information. There is the Supply Chain Risk Management Essential guideline that I linked here. CISO has also one specific for small and medium-sized business supply chains. It's a handbook. It's a resource handbook to reduce information and communication technology risks. And then, of course, what I consider the gold standard for cybersecurity supply chain risk management, that is NIST Special Publication 800-161.
So Robert, I did want to add one last point to that termination of contract piece.
Yes, please.
So there are so many teams, right, within the organization that get so busy and so wrapped up, and they completely forget to communicate to the legal team and the business owners that, hey, we're no longer using this vendor or this application or this service any longer. So in order to try and get them to remember or to buy into the process, remind them that it is a cost savings initiative. So that cost savings could go towards other resources within their organization. So kind of one thing to kind of, keep in mind as you're working on that termination of contract process to get the other teams to buy into it.
That is very important. Thank you, Kate. And I want to move over to question and answers. I see a comment here from Matt. Would you touch on the importance of linking in the vendor related legal and procurement teams and processes? Kate, do you want to take that one?
All right, and Matt, you can let me know if this is going to answer your question or not. So typically when you create your TPRM team, you're going to already be linked in with those procurement teams, those legal teams, the privacy and compliance, and your security teams. You should have some sort of representation from each team because each team should be communicating with each other. And this is in order to make sure that there's not teams within your organization that are avoiding the process of doing the assessment. So they, if someone comes to your procurement team and says, hey, we got this vendor or this application that we want to purchase, that procurement resource should be reaching out to the rest of that TPRM team and to that business owner and redirecting them to the process. And this is going to help ensure that the appropriate assessment is being performed, whether it's a tool assessment by, typically your cyber team, or the larger team if it's someone that's taking in your data. Also, on the similar track, if you're terminating your contract, you also have to, relate that back to these teams. So your IT team, your security team, making sure access is getting revoked, making sure that those contracts are being appropriately terminated, making sure that your procurement team is not still issuing payments to them, et cetera. So Matt, does that help answer your question, or do you have something in addition?
Yeah, I would also like to add, the importance of treating third-party risk management really as a program. You have multiple stakeholders, and the roles and responsibilities are typically defined at the program level. So who all needs to be involved? Who all has the ownership? What are the core activities that take place? Who is responsible for it? Who's accountable? And ensuring that all the necessary procedures are then developed and put into place and also monitored. So I think that's, at a program level where you want to instill the culture, of accountability, you would have really good definitions of the program. Any other questions? Just reading Matt's comment. Well, if there's no other questions, we are about 1.5 minutes early, so I will give that time back. Just before we close, any other closing comments, Kate?
No, I don't believe I have any. Just thank you all for attending, and if you guys think of anything, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Kate. And I hope everyone will continue to have a great time attending the next sessions that we have lined up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.